She was stabbed at least 11 times in her head, her neck, and her throat. I can't imagine what she was going through and how she was feeling, and it is horrible.
Within the Appalachian Mountains in the southeastern Kentucky, Floyd County is home to about 35,000 people. Within Floyd County, there are 63 cities and towns, including Prestonsburg, where a murder happened in June 2023. Floyd County may sound big, but it's truly not. There isn't much to do around there. The Appalachian Mountains are known for the intensity of keeping a secret and keeping hush-hush. If you think you've seen something, you didn't. And these concepts play into a huge factor of why I believe this case is still unsolved today. This episode includes murder, police cover-ups, Appalachian history, victim blaming, gender, bro code, and toxic masculinity. Listener discretion is advised. I want to give a message to the friends and family of Amber Spradlin. I know that someone involved in this case might listen to this one day, and my intentions are to only bring awareness to this case. And while I might use personal opinions to tell the story in a way that listeners can relate, I have the most up respect for Amber and her family. Amber Spradlin was born on October 7th, 1984, to Tom Spradlin and Sharon Robinson Spradlin. Amber was a member of the Prestonsburg Church of God and worked as a hostess at the local restaurant called The Brick House. Amber went through a lot of trials at a young age. When she was only 3 years old, Amber lost her mother, and a few years later, she lost her sister. Her mother was murdered and was found lodged in a window opening in the Wildcat Lounge in Prestonsburg, Kentucky, and her case is still unsolved today. Her sister Angie died due to injuries in an automobile accident. These earlyhood traumas left Amber to be taken into the care of her grandparents, Margie and James Merrill Osborne, where she lived with them and served as their caretaker until they passed away in 2022. In 2023, Amber had just started living her own life. She rented her first apartment and set goals to travel the world. Amber's aunt, Wanda Spradlin, communicated with me on who Amber truly was as a person. She said, Amber was a wonderful young lady who had just started to live her life. She always had kids around her, for she loved them truly, and they loved her. She had a way of making people feel loved and special. By no means did she deserve what happened to her. Amber sadly passed away on June 18th, 2023, at the age of 38. Amber was stabbed at least 11 times in the face, neck, and head. The biggest question that remains is who could have done these horrible things to a woman who seemed to love everyone. The podcast True Crime Garage stated that at the party, there was said to be 5 to 7 people there at the time of Amber's death. This was later proven to be at least 5 people based on a post made in the Facebook page Justice for Amber. Dr. McKinney, his son Michael K. McKinney, also known as MK, and Roy Kidd were confirmed to be at the party. It hasn't been released if there were 2 other people at the party or if there was just one more in Amber. At this party, it was said to be containing a lot of alcohol and that some people were extremely intoxicated. That eventually someone called 911 around 5 a.m. The 911 call hasn't been released to the public, but talk of the community says that there was a call regarding the extremely intoxicated person who was hurt and bleeding because of a fight. Now, people at the party have came out and said that the person who was bleeding was Roy Kidd. Now, no one knows what happened to Roy Kidd or why he was bleeding, or they know and they just aren't talking about it because they want to protect one another. But if he was bleeding, there are a few theories that could explain this. The first theory is that a fight broke out and Roy Kidd was part of it. But the explanation adds to the question of the identification of who the other person was and why they were fighting. The second theory is that Roy Kidd is the perpetrator because who usually stabs someone, they often get cut during themselves. The third theory is that Roy Kidd could have been protecting Amber from someone, but this adds the notion of who could he be protecting Amber from and why. Now, of course, the police gathered evidence from the McKinney house, and according to police reports, the scene was extremely bloody, and investigators collected 3 different DNA profiles from that scene. Now, we know one of the profiles belonged to Amber, but we don't know who the other 2 are. The other 2 profiles could have been anyone else that was there that night. but it could have also been anyone else that's ever entered into the McKinney house. The police haven't released the information about the source of the DNA, but I'm guessing it was probably blood, or it could have been any other form of DNA, really. I suspect that one of the other forms must have been Roy Kidd's, because he was said to be bleeding. Now, the third DNA could have been Dr. McKinney or anyone else that was there that night, but that's just my theory. Kentucky State Police gathered all the evidence they thought they needed from that house, including a bag full of bloody objects, electronic devices, and other physical evidence, and took them to one of the Kentucky State Forensics labs. And I tried looking up and seeing which one, but it was not letting me. And as of November 19th, the DNA results still haven't came back or been released to the public. Part of frustration around this whole case is the 911 calls made the morning of Amber's death. Even though the calls haven't been released to the public, a few people have gotten the opportunity to hear those calls. The earliest call was made around 5 a.m., and the call wasn't about Amber and wasn't made by Amber, but it was about someone at the McKinney house. Amber's cousin, Debbie Hall, told Lexington 18 News that she got to listen to the 911 call. She stated, "A man was drunk and bleeding profusely, perhaps after a fall. However, someone took the phone and said something around the lines of everything was under control and that the police did not need to come. So, no police came to the party to see what was going on, no wellness check, nothing." This is said to be because the call went to the city of Prestonsburg's 911 call center instead of the Kentucky State Police Center Post 9 in Pikeville. So to give some background, in December of 2022, the mayor of Prestonsburg and a judge decided to remove the 911 call duties from the Kentucky State Police Post 9 and send them all to Prestonsburg's 911 call center. The reason for this decision was to save a bunch of money. And residents have been confused since then. They didn't know who was supposed to be responding to calls and whether or not the city or the Kentucky police troops were supposed to respond. Since Amber's murder, a lot of people have been speaking out about how this dispatch system has failed them. In a video released by Mountaintop News, they heard from multiple residents that they have reported delays in dispatch and even got told that one person was still waiting for someone to respond to his 911 call from over 100 days ago. This is absolutely insane. However, the facts are that morning of June 18th that nobody responded to the 5 a.m. call made from the McKinney house. Did the system fail Amber? A lot of people in the community believe this system failed Amber. The main reason I believe it was failed is that no one responded to the call. The communication between dispatch center and the officers probably never even happened. With that being said, I do not believe the Prestonsburg Police or Kentucky State Police are trying to cover anything up, and neither does Amber's family. Amber's aunt, Melissa Simmons, reported to Mountaintop News that she believes the police are doing their job, and even said, "Nobody, as far as I know, nobody is trying to cover anything up." And finally went on to say, "The police are being very careful with the investigation. Very careful." Around 10 a.m., there was another phone call made from Dr. McKinney's house. Now, what I've heard through the grapevine is that this was Dr. McKinney calling to report that he found Amber's body. This then led police to go to his house where he found Amber's body. Her exact time of death hasn't been released to the public, but she was pronounced dead on arrival. Now here comes a report that annoys me the most. Throughout my research and scrolling through Spradlin's TikTok series of Amber, it has been discovered that Dr. McKinney or someone else made several phone calls to prominent figures at the same time or shortly before Dr. McKinney called the police to tell them what he found. Brandis tells us that her understanding is Dr. Mike McKinney discovered Amber's murdered body in his home, then proceeded to call 3 prominent figures of Floyd County before calling 911. Brandis then goes on to explain none of those figures hung up the phone with McKinney to call it in themselves. This makes me so pissed off because it seems like the man had no remorse of what happened to Amber. He just wanted to cover his own ass. Now, this is where toxic masculinity comes into play, let me tell you. See, McKinney wanted to make sure that he had other prominent figures on his side before he called in what he discovered. He only cared about himself and definitely did not care about who he brought down with him. He just wanted to remain on top. He cared more about his name and cared than he did about Amber and what happened in his house. This also showed that the Appalachian Bro Code, because the other prominent figures were protecting McKinney and still are, even though he told him what he discovered. None of them called this in themselves. Appalachian men stick together even when they are in the wrong, because it has been instilled in them since birth. Men put other men first before a woman, and in this case, a woman in need. Medical examiners determined that Amber had been stabbed 11 times in the face, neck, and head. Evidence pointed to Amber's cause of death being a slash done to her neck that went all the way to her spine. It has also been said by Dr. Debbie Hall, Amber's cousin, that a part of the knife was broken off in the temple of her head and that a knife went up under her cheekbone into her eye. Oh my gosh. This cause of death is so personal and definitely not defensive. The idea of personal comes from the areas that are targeted in rage behind the method of stabbing. In the podcast, Crime Stories with Nancy Grace, Nancy communicates with Dr. Bethany Marshall about the rage being up close and personal, and that the possibilities of why this might have happened are beyond our mind. The people at this party were allegedly Amber's friends, or friends of Amber's and her friends. As explained in this podcast, I too think Amber might have found something out that she shouldn't have known, and that someone didn't want her to know, and that this probably set someone off. The talk throughout the community is that Dr. McKinney was having an affair with someone at that party. Maybe Amber found out who this was, or seen something that she probably shouldn't have. But unfortunately, the details of what happened that night are still not to be released. So here, 5 months later, we are with the same questions that we started with. What happened to Amber? The part that troubles me the most is that Amber Spradlin wouldn't do anything to hurt anyone. Her family and friends say that she loved to help people no matter the cost, and that she loved being a gift giver. Unfortunately, history has shown women in Appalachia are treated like they are worth nothing and that they are disposable. Time and time again, women are being murdered in Appalachia and their cases are getting left in the dark. I mean, look at Amber's mom. Her case is still unsolved to this day. Now, sometimes this is due to the lack of resources, but most of the time it's due to cover-ups and people just not wanting to talk about it. However, this will not happen to Amber and her case. Her family members have come out multiple times on news reports stating that they will not rest until Amber's murderer or murderers have been held responsible for their actions. Now, let's get into my theory of what happened to Amber Spradlin that night. And all this is found based on the evidence, okay? This is not made up at all. This is just my brain putting the evidence together. So, on the night of Amber's death, she was at a party with at least 4 men that she had absolutely no romantic relationship with. Amber didn't have many friends growing up and still didn't, so being asked to party with some prominent people of Floyd County might have sounded like a dream to her. Amber left work and went to the bar. Now, this bar was owned by Dr. McKinney's brother. Kind of suspicious if you ask me. And this is probably where she had a couple drinks with Roy Kidd and Dr. McKinney. Amber probably was feeling good and having a good time. And when the bar closed, nobody wanted the party to be over. So they all traveled to Dr. McKinney's house, where more people showed up, including MK, by the way. This is McKinney's son, by the way. All right, so drinks are flowing and people are feeling good. This is when everything probably took a turn for the worse. So something broke out. We know that. And someone thought that they needed to get the police involved. I think MK was the one that called the police that night about the drunk person in the house. And I think that Dr. McKinney was the one that took the phone from him and said, hey, we got everything under control over here. Now, you might be asking yourself where I get this idea from. And that's from a TikToker that goes by the name of Boundless Millennial. He released a video with information that was pointed from a lead coming from someone that was close to this case. Now, I think Amber might have seen something that people didn't want her to see. This could have been Dr. McKinney's possible affair that is speculated to be with a man, by the way. But whatever Amber seen or heard led to MK being worried about his family and their image. I think that MK took things into his own hands and thought the best thing was to get rid of someone instead of his big, powerful last name being ruined. Now, if you know anything about last names, they mean everything in a small town, and especially when your family owns a lot of things in that town. MK is a student at Morehead State University here in Kentucky, where he is also part of a fraternity. Now, this kid is getting pounded with bro code. Now, MK has not been brought up in a lot of news press or social media videos, but the Facebook page for Justice for Amber Spradlin and people in that town sure do have a lot to say about MK. But also in the Boundless Millennials TikTok, we see an interview from Amber's cousin stating that the Kentucky State Police have told them that Dr. McKinney and his son MK are not cooperating with police. This then leads me into why Dr. McKinney called 3 prominent figures of Floyd County before calling the police. I think he made those calls to help cover up his son's ass, let's be honest. And this is why nobody is talking about his son, because he's off limits. Now, a lot of people point to Roy Kidd as the person that murdered Amber, and they think this because it was speculated that he was the one bleeding when they called police the first time. But through the help of a fellow classmate that is also following the Amber's case, she was able to use her connections to the community to talk to someone that says they were there that night and seen Roy Kidd. They said that they seen Roy Kidd and that he was bleeding from the chin and was covered in blood. But again, speculation, and no reports about this have been released. However, from the same person, they revealed that MK left the party sometime that night. But I just don't see Dr. McKinney covering his friend's ass as much as he would his own, and especially his son. I just don't see it. I just don't see a man calling 3 prominent figures before calling the police for a friend. While Appalachia does have their bro codes, where men will protect men no matter what, it doesn't compare to anything of the connection to family, and especially when it impacts their patriarchy. The amount of work Dr. McKinney put into covering his ass and possibly his own sons was tremendous. In Appalachia, and even small towns where your last name means a lot, one bad thing about your name can ruin your family and that last name for the rest of time. But the big question is, that leaves me with, why did MK leave? And where was he going? And did anyone see him before he left? If so, did he look distraught? In the end, this is just my theory, based on a little bit of evidence that I gathered while writing this podcast. All the evidence I used from this podcast did come from news sources, podcasts, TikToks, and people from the community. I do believe justice for Amber Spradlin is coming. I truly believe that. And so does Amber's family and the community. The evidence that has been released to the public is really limited, let's be honest. But I don't think the police are giving up. In the end, catching the killers or killer of Amber Spradlin is the most important thing. Amber is truly missed by her family, friends, and community. Debbie Hall posted on the Justice for Amber Facebook page these words on November 6th. 20 weeks. 20 long weeks. Too long. Patience is wearing thin, especially when I hear each week which bar, which restaurant, and which state they've been spotted in. Now we have Thanksgiving and Christmas coming, and this is just not fair, not right. Please, everyone pray for resolution in this horrendous injustice. Not sure how much more we can stand. Amber's chair at the family dinner table will never be filled again. This family deserves answers, and the people responsible need to pay for their actions. The 22,000 people on the Justice for Amber's Facebook page, including myself, will not rest until the proper actions are taken. Justice for Amber Spradlin.